Part 1. All Saints' Morning. The first light of November 1st, 1755, crept over Lisbon like a benediction. It was All Saints' Day, the Dia de Todos os Santos, when the faithful of Portugal's glittering capital would fill every church, chapel, and cathedral to honor the dead and pray for their souls. The morning air carried the salt-sweet smell of the Tagus River mixing with the aroma of fresh bread from bakeries already at work, preparing for the feast day that would follow the masses. In the Alfama district, when narrow cobbled streets twisted upward from the waterfront like a labyrinth of whitewashed stone, Maria Rodriguez was already dressed in her finest black mantilla. She was a washerwoman, her hands permanently reddened from lye and cold water, but on holy days she transformed herself into something approaching respectability. Her husband, João, a stevedore at the bustling port, had died 3 years earlier when a cargo crane collapsed. Today she would light candles for his soul at the Igreja de São Vicente de Fora, the great monastery church that stood like a sentinel over the eastern hills. The city that spread before her, as she climbed toward the church, was perhaps the fourth largest in Europe, home to between 200,000 and 275,000 souls. The exact number was a matter of endless debate among the city's administrators. But numbers could not capture what Lisbon truly was, a city drunk on wealth and faith in equal measure. The gold of Brazil flowed through its streets like a golden river. The diamonds of the colony's interior adorned the necks of noble women who rode in gilded carriages through streets where beggars displayed their wounds for alms. It was a city of profound contradictions, where the Inquisition's shadow still fell across certain neighborhoods, where magnificent baroque palaces stood mere steps from hovels that housed families of 10 in a single room. The Ribeira Palace, residence of King José I, dominated the waterfront with its 300 rooms, its library containing 70,000 volumes, its galleries hung with works by Titian and Rubens. Nearby stood the Casa de India, the nerve center of Portugal's vast colonial empire, where clerks worked by candlelight even on this holy morning, recording shipments of sugar, tobacco, gold, and slaves. The patriarchal cathedral, the Sé, with its twin towers and Romanesque facade, had watched over the city since the 12th century, its stones remembering when Lisbon was still called A Lisbiona and the calls to prayer echoed from minarets instead of church bells. As the morning advanced toward 9 o'clock, the churches began to fill. In the royal chapel of the Ribeira Palace, King José I attended Mass with his family, though his mind wandered to the hunting lodge at Belém where he increasingly preferred to spend his time. The king was not a man of great intellect or ambition. He had inherited his throne 8 years earlier and was content to leave the business of governing largely to his formidable minister, Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, who would later be known to history as the Marquis of Pombal. In the Igreja do Carmo, perched on a ridge overlooking the Ratio Square, hundreds of worshippers knelt on cold stone floors. The Gothic church was a masterpiece of pointed arches and soaring vaults, its construction begun in 1389. The morning light filtered through stained glass windows, casting pools of colored radiance across the faces of the devout. Among them was Joaquim Santos, a merchant who had made his fortune in the spice trade with Goa. He owned 3 ships and a warehouse near the Terreiro do Paco, the great plaza that served as the ceremonial heart of the city. His wife knelt beside him, their 8 children arrayed like steps of descending height, the youngest barely 4 years old and squirming with the impatience of the very young. In the convents and monasteries that dotted the city, São Domingos, São Francisco, Santa Maria de Belém, Santo Agostinho, monks and nuns observed the elaborate rituals of the day with practiced precision. The Hieronymite monastery at Belém, funded by the legendary spice tax that had enriched the crown beyond measure, was perhaps the most splendid of all, its manuline facade a riot of maritime motifs carved in honey-colored limestone, ropes, anchors, coral, chains, and the armillary sphere that symbolized Portugal's dominion over unknown seas. Down at the waterfront, where merchant vessels from Amsterdam, London, Hamburg, and Genoa lay at anchor, foreign sailors who had been given shore leave wandered through streets made unfamiliar by the holiday. The taverns that normally roared with business were shuttered. Even the brothels of the Baixa district had closed their doors, or at least drawn their curtains, in deference to the sacred day. A German named Heinrich Braun, first mate on a Bremen-registered merchantman, walked along the Quais de Pedra, smoking his pipe and marveling at the architectural splendor that seemed almost defiant in its opulence. He had been to many ports, but none matched Lisbon's peculiar combination of elegance and decay, wealth and poverty, calculation and faith. The hour approached 9:30. In churches across the city, priests elevated the host during the consecration of the Mass. In the Basilica de Estrela, not yet built, but in homes and chapels throughout the parishes, candles flickered before images of saints. The smoke of incense rose toward painted ceilings where angels and martyrs gazed down with expressions of eternal serenity. No one noticed the dogs first. Perhaps because All Saints' Day was so crowded with human observance, so thick with ritual and prayer, that the behavior of animals went unremarked. But in the streets of Alfama and Moreira, in the alleys behind the Castelo de São Jorge that crowned the highest hill, dogs had begun to bark with an urgency that had no apparent cause. Horses in stables stamped and whinnied, their eyes rolling white with an ancient, pre-human terror. Rats emerged from sewers in unusual numbers, streaming across cobblestones in defiance of daylight and their usual caution. At approximately 9:40 in the morning, Maria Rodriguez was climbing the final steps to São Vicente de Fora when she felt something she would later struggle to describe. It was not exactly a tremor, not yet. It was more like a presence, a pressure in the air, the way the atmosphere thickens before a great storm. She paused, one hand on the sun-warmed stone of the church wall, and looked out across the city spread below her. The terracotta roofs cascaded down to the river, which glittered like beaten silver under the cloudless sky. It was, she thought, almost painfully beautiful. In the Igreja do Carmo, Joaquim Santos' youngest child began to cry. The merchant reached to comfort the boy, but something in the child's terror gave him pause. It was not the familiar whimper of boredom or discomfort. It was a shriek of pure, instinctive fear, the kind of sound that bypassed reason and spoke directly to something ancient in the human brain. The priest at the altar continued his intoned Latin, unaware or unconcerned. Then the world began to move. It started as a rumble, deep and impossibly low, more felt than heard, a sound that seemed to come not from any direction but from within the earth itself, from some vast hollow in the planet's core. For a moment, perhaps 3 or 4 seconds, nothing seemed to happen. The rumble continued growing, but the visual world remained stable. People looked at each other in confusion and dawning fear. Then Lisbon began to dance. The first shock wave arrived with the force of a horizontal avalanche. Buildings that had stood for centuries suddenly swayed like wheat in wind. The Igreja do Carmo shuddered, and Joaquim Santos heard, and possibly loud, a sound he had never heard before and would never forget, the screaming of stone under stress. Cracks appeared in the walls, thin dark lines that raced across white plaster like lightning in reverse. The stained glass windows exploded outward in a rainbow of deadly shrapnel. He threw himself over his children, his wife's screams lost in the overwhelming roar of the earth's fury. Around them, the congregation broke. Panic dissolved any pretense of order. People trampled each other in their desperation to reach the doors, but the Gothic arches that had stood for 366 years were failing. Great blocks of limestone, each weighing tons, began to fall from the vaulted ceiling. The first killed a merchant whose name no one would ever record. The second crushed a mother and her infant. The third, fourth, fifth fell like judgment from an angry god, and the screaming intensified into something beyond human, something primal and terrible. The earth heaved again. This was not one earthquake but many, a series of shock waves that came in pulses of destruction. Witnesses would later report that the ground moved in visible waves, like the surface of the sea. Buildings that had survived the first shock collapsed in the second or third. The Igreja do Carmo's roof gave way with a roar like thunder, the great stone vaults falling inward, taking with them the dreams of medieval masons and the lives of perhaps 300 souls who had come to pray. Maria Rodriguez, still outside São Vicente de Fora, was thrown to the ground with such force that she bit through her own tongue. Blood filled her mouth as she watched the city below begin to disintegrate. Buildings she had known all her life, landmarks that had seemed as permanent as the hills themselves, were falling like houses of cards. Clouds of dust rose from each collapse, merging into a vast choking fog that began to obscure the destruction even as it continued. The Ribeira Palace, 300 rooms of royal splendor, began to tear itself apart. The king and his family, by the mercy of location, their private chapel was in a particularly well-built wing, survived the initial shocks and fled into the gardens. But the library, with its 70,000 books, collapsed into rubble. The art galleries, the state rooms, the throne room where ambassadors from every nation had once bowed before Portuguese majesty, all were being reduced to broken stone and splintered wood. At the waterfront, Heinrich Braun, the German sailor, watched in incomprehension as the water of the Tagus began to behave in ways water should not behave. It was pulling back, retreating from the shore with a speed that seemed impossible, revealing mudflats and the hulls of sunken ships, ancient anchors and the bones of drowned men. The merchant vessels at anchor tilted crazily as their keels struck mud that should have been under fathoms of water. He understood before most of the Portuguese. He had heard stories from sailors who had visited the Indies. He began to run, screaming in German, then in his broken Portuguese. Fujim! Fujim! Aon the Vem! Run! The wave is coming! But his warnings were lost in the chaos of the earthquake, which continued to rip the city apart. The duration of the quake, or rather, the series of 3 major shocks, has been estimated by modern seismologists at between 3 and 6 minutes. But to those experiencing it, time lost all meaning. It could have been hours. It could have been eternity. The world had ended, and they were living through the apocalypse. When the shaking finally stopped, Lisbon was transformed. Perhaps a third of the city's buildings had collapsed entirely. Another third were so damaged as to be uninhabitable. Fires had already begun in dozens of locations, started by the candles and oil lamps that had been lit for All Saints' Day observances. These fires would soon merge into a conflagration that would dwarf the earthquake itself in destructive power. And at the waterfront, the water was still retreating, still pulling back, exposing more and more of the river bottom, gathering itself for what would come next. Maria Rodriguez, her mouth still full of blood, began to pray. Part 2. The Three Horsemen. The silence that followed the earthquake was perhaps more terrible than the roaring that had preceded it. It was not true silence, of course. The air was filled with the groans of the wounded, the crash of secondary collapses as weakened structures finally gave way, the crackle of flames beginning their work. But after the overwhelming cacophony of the earth's fury, this seemed like silence, a shocked pause in which the city held its breath and tried to comprehend what had been done to it. Joaquim Santos lay in darkness. Above him, perhaps 6 feet above, was stone, a massive block of limestone that had fallen at an angle, creating a pocket of survival in what had been the nave of the Igreja do Carmo. He could not move his legs. Something was pinning them, something heavy and immovable. In the absolute blackness, he took inventory by touch and sound. His wife was beside him. He could hear her breathing, rapid and shallow, the breathing of someone in shock. 2 of his children, he thought it was Anna and little Tomas, were pressed against him, their small bodies trembling. The other 6 he could not account for. He called their names into the darkness. Pedro! Miguel! Isabel! Caterina! Joao! Rosa! His voice cracked, thick with dust and emotion. No answer came, or if it did, it was lost in the labyrinth of rubble that had been a church. Elsewhere in the city, thousands were trapped in similar circumstances. The Say Cathedral, despite its age and solid Romanesque construction, had suffered catastrophic damage. The towers that had dominated the skyline were rubble. In the Royal Hospital of Todos os Santos, All Saints, in a bitter irony, which stood in the Ratio Square, the sick and injured had become casualties. The building had collapsed almost entirely, burying patients, physicians, and nuns of the order that ran the facility. Those who survived the initial collapse now lay trapped in darkness, wondering if rescue would come before the fires that were beginning to spread reached them. The fires were inevitable. November in Lisbon was cool but dry, and the city was a tinderbox of wooden supports, furniture, tapestries, and thatch. In nearly every home and church, candles had been burning for the All Saints observances. When the earthquake struck, these candles fell, often into combustible materials. In kitchens throughout the city, cooking fires had been preparing the feast day meals. These too were scattered by the tremors, coals and embers finding ready fuel in collapsed wooden buildings. Father Antonio Pereira, a Jesuit priest who had been saying Mass in the church of São Roque when the earthquake struck, emerged from the damaged but still standing structure to witness the city's transformation. São Roque, with its plain exterior hiding one of Europe's most opulent interiors, had survived relatively intact, perhaps because its construction was more recent than many of Lisbon's churches, completed in 1619 with methods that unknowingly incorporated some earthquake-resistant principles. The priest stood in the church's doorway, his vestments torn and dusty, and watched as pillars of smoke began to rise from dozens of locations across the Baixa district. The fires started small, isolated, a curtain catching flame here, a wooden beam smoldering there. But the earthquake had done more than simply topple buildings. It had broken the city's bones, creating perfect chimneys and channels through which flames could spread. Within an hour of the final tremor, at least 20 significant fires were burning. Within 2 hours, these had begun to merge into larger conflagrations. The narrow streets of medieval Lisbon, charming in peacetime, became death traps as fires spread from building to building faster than people could flee. Father Pereira made a decision that would save his life. Instead of attempting to help those trapped in nearby buildings, a Christian duty that called to him powerfully, he began to move toward open ground, toward the gardens and squares where fire could not so easily reach. He was not alone in this calculation. All over Lisbon, people were making impossible choices: to stay and dig for buried loved ones, or to flee before fire or further collapse claimed them too. But there was another danger coming, one that almost no one in Lisbon understood. At the waterfront, the Tagus River had continued its impossible retreat. Where an hour ago ships had floated in 30 feet of water, now there was exposed mud stretching hundreds of yards from shore. The hulks of ancient vessels emerged like skeletons from the earth: Roman galleys, medieval caravels, ships from conflicts so old their names had been forgotten. The living vessels, the merchant fleet that had been at anchor when the earthquake struck, lay heeled over on their sides, their crews scrambling down rope ladders in confusion and terror. Heinrich Braun, the German sailor, had not stopped running. He had sprinted from the waterfront up the steep streets toward higher ground, his lungs burning, his sailor's instinct screaming at him that what he had seen meant death. Behind him, hundreds of people were doing the opposite. They were moving toward the water, toward the Terreiro do Paco and the riverfront, because these open spaces seemed safe from the fires beginning to rage through the city's interior and safe from collapsing buildings. The Terreiro do Paco, the palace square, though the palace itself was already damaged beyond use, was a massive plaza paved with marble, designed to impress visiting dignitaries with Portugal's imperial might. It was bordered on 3 sides by elegant arcaded buildings housing government ministries, and on the 4th side by the river itself. To the thousands who now crowded into this space, it seemed like salvation. Here there were no buildings to fall, no narrow streets to become corridors of flame. Here, with the river at their backs, they could wait for the danger to pass. The survivors crowding into the Terreiro do Paco represented a cross-section of Lisbon society. Nobles in their finery stood beside beggars in rags. Priests offered prayers while merchants counted the cost of warehouses full of cargo now buried or burning. Children wailed for parents lost in the collapse. The wounded lay on the marble paving stones, bleeding from cuts where broken glass and stone had found them. Some had burns already, having escaped from buildings where fire had followed earthquake. Others displayed the grotesque angles of broken bones, or the vacant stares of those who had seen too much horror too quickly and had retreated into some interior sanctuary. Among them was Francisco Luis de Mendonça, a minor nobleman who had been at the Ribeira Palace when the earthquake struck. He had helped the royal family escape to their carriages, had watched the king's face drain of color as his palace, the symbol of Braganza power, tore itself apart. Now Mendonça stood in the Terreiro do Paco, his court clothes ridiculous in their continued elegance, and tried to make sense of what had happened. Was this a divine judgment? Was this the end of the world foretold in Revelation? Or was it simply nature's indifference to human ambition? The question would remain unanswered, because at approximately 11 o'clock in the morning, the river returned. The tsunami, a word that did not yet exist in European languages, though the phenomenon was well known to coastal peoples of the Pacific, had been born hundreds of miles away, in the depths of the Atlantic Ocean. The earthquake that destroyed Lisbon had its epicenter in the Azores Gibraltar Transform Fault, approximately 120 miles west-southwest of Cape St. Vincent. The rupture had been massive, later estimated at magnitude 8.5 to 9.0, making it one of the most powerful earthquakes in recorded history. This rupture had displaced an enormous volume of water, creating waves that radiated outward in all directions at the speed of a jet aircraft. These waves, in the deep ocean, were barely noticeable, long, low undulations that would have passed undetected beneath any ship. But as they approached the Portuguese coast, as the water grew shallow and the continental shelf rose to meet them, the waves transformed. The energy that had been distributed through the depth of the ocean was compressed, forced upward, gathering itself into walls of water that could reach heights of 50 feet or more. The first anyone in the Terreiro do Paco knew of the tsunami was when someone pointed at the river and screamed. The water was rising, not flowing back normally, but rising in a wall, a vertical face of green-brown water studded with debris, with pieces of destroyed ships, with the contents of the river bottom churned up and suspended in the advancing mass. It moved with impossible speed, and it made a sound, a roar like continuous thunder, or like some immense beast awakening from sleep in the deep places of the world. Those nearest the water's edge began to run. But the Terreiro do Paco was packed with thousands of people, and panic creates its own paralysis. Bodies became obstacles. The elderly fell and were trampled. Parents lost grip on children's hands. The waves struck the shoreline and kept coming, not breaking like an ocean wave but pushing forward, a moving wall of destruction that swept across the marble plaza like a broom's sweeping dust. Heinrich Braun, from his position halfway up the hill of the Alfama district, watched in horror. The wave engulfed the Terreiro do Paco, swallowed the thousands who had sought safety there, and kept going, pushing inland through streets, carrying bodies and debris, smashing into already damaged buildings and toppling them completely. He could hear the screaming even from his distance, a collective wail of terror that seemed to come from the city itself. The water reached perhaps 250 meters inland before its energy was spent. Then it began to retreat, pulling back toward the river, and taking with it everything it had captured: people, furniture, cargo from destroyed warehouses, stones from collapsed buildings, and the bodies of those who had died in the earthquake but had not yet been buried. The withdrawal was almost as destructive as the advance, as the current dragged against weakened structures and pulled them down, as people who had somehow survived the wave's arrival were swept out into the Tagus, their fingers scrabbling uselessly against cobblestones, their lungs filling with water thick with mud and debris. But it was not over. The tsunami came in waves, at least 3 major surges, possibly more. Each time, the water would retreat, exposing the devastation, tempting the desperate to venture out to search for survivors or possessions. And each time, it would return, catching those who had dared to hope that the worst had passed. The timing between waves was irregular, sometimes 20 minutes, sometimes an hour, which made prediction impossible and survival largely a matter of chance. Maria Rodriguez, who had remained on the heights near São Vicente de Fora, watched the city being destroyed by 3 separate catastrophes. First, the earthquake had toppled buildings. Then the fires had begun to spread, orange and red blooms of destruction flowering across the Baixa and Ratio. Now the waves were attacking from the river, each surge pushing further into the wounded city, each withdrawal leaving new devastation in its wake. She thought of the Book of Revelation, of the 7 seals and the 4 horsemen, and wondered if perhaps there had been a mistake in the counting. Here were 3 horsemen at least: earthquake, fire, and flood, and they were making war on Lisbon with a thoroughness that seemed almost personal. In his pocket of survival beneath the ruins of the Igreja do Carmo, Joaquim Santos knew nothing of the tsunami. His world had contracted to darkness, pain, and the sound of his wife's breathing. He had stopped calling his children's names. In the hours since the collapse, he had accepted what his heart had known immediately. The 6 children he could not account for were dead, crushed under tons of stone or suffocated in spaces too small for survival. He held Ana and Tomas closer, felt their small hearts beating against him, and prayed to a God who seemed to have turned away from Lisbon. The fires were spreading. Father Antonio Pereira, who had made it to the relative safety of the gardens near the Estrela Hill, could see the conflagration from his vantage point. The wind had picked up, a hot wind generated by the fires themselves, creating their own weather system, and was spreading embers across the city. Buildings that had survived earthquake and tsunami were now being consumed by flames. The smoke rose in a column visible for miles out to sea, a black pillar that marked Lisbon's funeral pyre. The Ribeira Palace was burning. The Casa de India, archive of empire, was burning. The customs house, containing records of centuries of trade, was burning. In the Igreja de São Domingos, where the Inquisition had once held auto de fes, the flames found particularly eager fuel in the wooden furnishings and ecclesiastical trappings. The Santo Antonio Hospital, the Patriarchal Church, the Convent of São Francisco, all were being consumed. The fire spread with such speed and ferocity that people trapped in collapsed buildings faced a new horror, the choice between being crushed or being burned alive. Those who could move began an exodus from the city. Thousands streamed out along the roads leading north and east, carrying what they could, abandoning what they couldn't. Some pushed carts loaded with saved possessions. Others carried injured family members on makeshift stretchers. Many carried nothing but the clothes they wore and the trauma they had witnessed. They looked back at their city and saw it disappearing behind veils of smoke, being eaten by flames that seemed to touch the sky. As night fell on November 1, 1755, Lisbon was a vision of hell. The fires lit the darkness with a fierce orange glow that could be seen from ships 50 miles out to sea. The smoke was so thick that survivors reported not being able to see the stars. The temperature in the burning districts rose so high that lead roofs melted and ran like water through the streets. In some areas, the fire created its own winds, generating firestorms that sucked oxygen from the air and made breathing difficult even hundreds of yards away. King Jose I, who had fled with his family to a hastily erected tent city in the hills of Belém, received reports throughout the day and into the night. Each report was worse than the last. The city was being destroyed. The death toll was in the thousands, possibly the tens of thousands. The palace was gone. The government archives were gone. The wealth accumulated from a century of Brazilian gold was buried under rubble or consumed by flames. Portugal's imperial capital, the jewel of the Atlantic, was ceasing to exist. In the royal tent, lit by candles that seemed a mockery after what candles had done to his city, the king wept. He was not a strong man or a particularly capable one, but he understood that he was witnessing the end of something. Not just the destruction of a city, but the end of an era, the closing of a chapter in Portugal's story. What would come next, he could not imagine. Outside the tent, his chief minister Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, the man who would become Pombal, was already making plans. While others prayed or wept or fled, his mind was calculating, organizing, preparing for what needed to be done. The fires would burn themselves out eventually. The bodies would need to be buried. The survivors would need food, shelter, medicine. And then, perhaps, the city could be rebuilt. But first, they would need to survive the night. And in a city where fire ruled unchallenged, where collapsed buildings held thousands of trapped victims, where disease would surely follow in the wake of so much death, survival was far from guaranteed. The three horsemen were not finished with Lisbon yet. Part 3: The Fires of Judgment. Dawn on November 2nd revealed a city that seemed to belong to another world, or perhaps to no world at all, a landscape so transformed that survivors wandering through it could not recognize streets they had walked their entire lives. The fires still burned, having raged uncontrolled through the night, and would continue burning for another 5 days. In some quarters, particularly the Baixa district that had been the commercial heart of Lisbon, the flames had achieved such intensity that stone itself had begun to liquefy, creating rivers of molten rock that flowed through gutters designed for rainwater. Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo had not slept. The king's minister was 56 years old, a man of aristocratic birth but modest means who had clawed his way to power through intelligence, ruthlessness, and an almost frightening capacity for work. He had been ambassador to London and Vienna, had studied the administrative methods of more efficiently governed nations, and had returned to Portugal burning with frustration at his country's backwardness, its dependence on Brazilian gold, its domination by the church and the old nobility. Now, standing in the hills above the burning city, he saw something that others might have seen as catastrophe but that he recognized as opportunity. His first actions revealed the methodical mind that would define the reconstruction. While others still processed their shock, Pombal had already dispatched riders to the provinces with orders to send food, tents, and medical supplies to Lisbon. He had ordered the army to establish checkpoints on roads leading out of the city, not to prevent people from leaving, but to prevent looting and to maintain some semblance of order. And he had sent trusted men into the ruins with notebooks, instructing them to begin documenting the damage, street by street, building by building. Information was power, and Pombal understood that whoever controlled the information about the disaster would control the response to it. One of his first questions to subordinates became famous, later embellished into legend. "What now? We bury the dead and feed the living." Whether he actually said these precise words is uncertain, but they captured the brutal pragmatism that would characterize his management of the crisis. There was no time for elaborate mourning, no luxury of processing grief. The living needed help, and they needed it immediately. In the ruins of the Igreja do Carmo, Joaquim Santos had lost track of time. The darkness beneath the rubble was absolute, unchanging, making hours indistinguishable from minutes. His wife had stopped responding to his voice sometime during the night. He had felt for her pulse. His hands were free, though his legs remained trapped, and found nothing. Ana and Tomas still breathed, but weakly, and little Tomas had developed a cough that sounded ominously wet. The air in their pocket was growing stale, thick with dust and the smell of death. He had always considered himself a devout man. He attended Mass faithfully, contributed to the church, kept the feast days and the fasts. But trapped in this darkness, with his wife's cooling body beside him and his children dying by degrees, he found that his faith had become something different, not the comfortable certainty of the prosperous believer, but something harder and more desperate. He prayed not for understanding or acceptance, but for rescue, for air, for light, for life. His prayers had become reduced to their essence, stripped of all ornament, please. 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 Above ground, rescue efforts were beginning, but they were chaotic and insufficient. There was no organized emergency response, no system for locating survivors or prioritizing rescues. Individual families and neighbors worked to free their own trapped loved ones, but the scale of the disaster overwhelmed these individual efforts. Thousands were buried beneath collapsed buildings, and for every person freed, a dozen others remained trapped, their voices growing weaker as hours turned to days. The fires complicated everything. Rescuers approaching a collapsed building might find their work suddenly interrupted by flames spreading from an adjacent structure. Men digging through rubble to reach survivors would be forced to abandon their efforts and flee as fire advanced. In many cases, those trapped in the rubble could hear rescuers above them, could hear voices and the sounds of digging, only to have those sounds retreat as fire made further work impossible. The psychological torture of this, to know that help was near but could not reach you, drove some to madness. Father Antonio Pereira organized a group of survivors into an improvised rescue team. They worked in the Chiado district, where many buildings had partially collapsed but where the fires had not yet taken full hold. Using nothing but their hands, wooden beams as levers, and ropes salvaged from the docks, they freed perhaps 40 people in the first 2 days. But they also discovered 100 more who were beyond help, dead from crushing injuries, from suffocation, from bleeding that could not be stopped without medical care that was simply unavailable. The priest found his faith tested in ways his theological training had never prepared him for. One woman, trapped beneath a fallen wall with her chest crushed, had begged him to kill her, to end the pain. He had refused, had prayed with her instead, had held her hand for the 3 hours it took her to die. A child, perhaps 7 years old, had been found alive but trapped in a space too small for an adult to enter. They had worked for hours to enlarge the opening, but when they finally pulled her free, both her legs were crushed beyond any hope of saving. She had died from shock within minutes, and Father Pereira had been left to wonder if their rescue had been mercy or cruelty. The question of what to do with the dead became urgent. In normal times, Catholic Lisbon would have given its deceased elaborate funerals, with masses and processions and burial in consecrated ground. But these were not normal times. Bodies were everywhere, in the streets, beneath rubble, floating in the Tagus. The November sun was not particularly hot, but it was warm enough that decomposition had begun. The smell of death, mixing with smoke from the fires, created an atmosphere that was almost tangible, a miasma that seemed to cling to skin and clothes. Pombal made another decision that scandalized the clergy but saved the city. He ordered mass burials at sea. Boats collected bodies from the waterfront and the debris-choked river and took them out to deep water, where they were weighted with stones and dropped overboard. The priests protested. These souls were being denied proper burial, were being sent to their eternal rest without the prayers and ceremonies the Church demanded. But Pombal was unmoved. Disease would kill more people than the earthquake had, he argued, if the bodies were not disposed of quickly. The dead were beyond caring about ceremony. The living needed protection. Similar orders went out for bodies recovered from the ruins. They were taken to large pits dug on the outskirts of the city and buried in mass graves, often with nothing more than a priest's hasty blessing. The identities of many would never be known. Entire families had been obliterated, leaving no one to search for them, no one to mourn them, no one to remember their names. The question that obsessed everyone, survivor and observer alike, was why. Why had God allowed this to happen? Why had this catastrophe struck on All Saints' Day, of all days, when the faithful were gathered in churches, when the city's population was engaged in the most sacred of activities? The theological implications were staggering and deeply troubling. Some preachers saw it as divine punishment. Lisbon, they proclaimed, had been a new Sodom, corrupted by wealth, tolerant of vice, infected with modern ideas that questioned church authority. The earthquake was God's judgment on a sinful city. This interpretation found ready acceptance among many, particularly among the lower classes who had always resented the ostentatious wealth of the nobility and merchant classes. If God had destroyed the palaces and churches while sparing many of the humble dwellings in outer districts, perhaps that said something about where his sympathies lay. But this interpretation was problematic. It required believing in a God who would kill tens of thousands of people, many of them innocents, many of them children, many of them actively engaged in worship when death struck. It required believing in a God who would destroy his own churches, kill his own priests and nuns, obliterate hospitals and orphanages. Was this the God of mercy that the Church had preached? Or was this the wrathful Old Testament God, the one who had destroyed cities with fire and brimstone, who had drowned the world in a flood? Others rejected the idea of divine punishment entirely. The earthquake, they argued, was a natural phenomenon, not a supernatural one. It was the result of underground vapors or volcanic action or some other physical cause that science might eventually explain. This interpretation was particularly popular among the educated classes, among those who had read Descartes and Newton, who had begun to see the universe as operating according to natural laws rather than divine whim. This debate would echo far beyond Lisbon. Across Europe, philosophers and theologians would grapple with what the Lisbon earthquake meant. Voltaire would write his Poème sur le désastre de Lisbonne, questioning how this catastrophe could be reconciled with the optimistic philosophy that insisted we lived in the best of all possible worlds. Rousseau would respond, arguing that the real lesson was that humans should not crowd themselves into cities, should not build towering structures that became death traps when the earth shook. Kant would write multiple essays on the earthquake, attempting to develop a purely physical explanation for the phenomenon. The Lisbon earthquake would become, in effect, one of the founding moments of modern philosophy, the moment when European thought began to seriously question whether the universe was fundamentally benevolent or fundamentally indifferent to human suffering. But for the survivors picking through the ruins, these philosophical debates were luxuries they could not afford. They had more immediate concerns: finding food, finding shelter, finding their missing loved ones or confirming their deaths. The practical challenges of survival in a destroyed city overwhelmed everything else. Water was a critical problem. The earthquake had broken the aqueduct that supplied Lisbon with fresh water. Wells had been contaminated by seawater from the tsunami or had collapsed entirely. Survivors were forced to drink from the river, despite knowing that the Tagus was full of debris and bodies. Disease followed inevitably. Dysentery broke out within days, adding to the death toll. Those who had survived earthquake, tsunami, and fire now faced the slower but equally deadly threat of illness spreading through crowded refugee camps where thousands huddled in tents or improvised shelters. Food was almost as scarce. The earthquake had destroyed granaries and warehouses. Ships carrying provisions had been wrecked in the tsunami. The normal market system had collapsed completely. Pombal addressed this by sending soldiers to guard what food stores remained and by implementing rationing. He also commandeered supplies from the provinces, often over the protests of local officials who wanted to keep resources for their own communities. His methods were autocratic, sometimes brutal, but they worked. The distribution of food in Lisbon, though meager, remained relatively orderly, preventing the kind of food riots that might have turned catastrophe into complete chaos. Looting was another concern. With so much property destroyed and so many valuables lying in the ruins, the temptation to steal was enormous. Some looting was simple survival, people taking food or clothes from abandoned homes because they had lost everything. But other looting was purely criminal. Gangs roamed through the ruins at night, breaking into damaged buildings to steal gold, jewelry, and anything else of value. They sometimes murdered people they found trapped in rubble, rather than helping them, if those people had visible wealth. Pombal's response was characteristically severe. He declared martial law and ordered the army to shoot looters on sight. Gallows were erected in public squares, and several looters were hanged as examples, their bodies left to swing as warnings. Whether this harsh justice was necessary or excessive has been debated by historians, but it certainly had an effect. After the first executions, looting decreased dramatically. On the fourth day after the earthquake, rescuers finally reached the ruins of the Igreja do Carmo. They heard, faintly, a man's voice calling from beneath the rubble. It took them 6 hours of careful digging to create an opening large enough to extract survivors. Joaquim Santos emerged into the light, blinking, his legs broken, his mind barely functioning. They pulled out his 2 children next, Ana alive, Tomas dead, having suffocated sometime during the 3rd night. Then they found his wife's body, and the bodies of his other 6 children, all together in a space that had once been beneath a side altar. Santos was taken to one of the field hospitals that had been established in the hills above the city. There, a surgeon examined his legs and determined that one would need to be amputated. There was no anesthetic available, only rum to dull the pain and leather to bite down on. The operation was performed on a wooden table under the open sky, with Santos screaming despite the rum, despite his exhaustion, despite everything. When it was over, when his ruined leg had been separated from his body and thrown onto a pile of other amputated limbs, he lay in the dirt and wished that the rescuers had never found him, that he had been allowed to die in the darkness with his family. But he lived. He lived because Pombal's organization, however ruthless, was effective. He lived because food reached the camps, because water was distributed, because the field hospitals, understaffed and undersupplied as they were, managed to save some of those they treated. He lived, and would have to find a way to continue living in a world that no longer made sense, in a city that no longer existed, with a family that had been erased from the earth as thoroughly as if they had never been. The fires burned themselves out on November 6th, 5 days after the earthquake. What they left behind was a city center reduced almost entirely to ash and rubble. The Baixa district, which had been the commercial heart of Lisbon, was gone. The Ratio, which had been a center of social life, was an open grave. The waterfront, which had hosted the ships of the world, was a wasteland of broken stone and twisted metal. Estimates of the dead varied wildly. Some put the number at 10,000, others at 100,000. Modern historians, working from fragmentary records and demographic analysis, generally estimate between 30,000 and 50,000 deaths in Lisbon itself, with additional thousands killed in other Portuguese towns and cities affected by the earthquake and tsunami. But these numbers, precise as they attempt to be, cannot capture the reality of what had been lost. It was not just individuals who died, but families, entire lineages, communities. It was not just buildings that were destroyed, but memories, histories, irreplaceable records of Portugal's past. And yet, even in this landscape of ashes, Pombal was already planning the future. He had his surveyors working, had architects drawing plans, had engineers calculating what could be saved and what must be demolished. Where others saw ending, he saw beginning. Lisbon had been destroyed. Very well. Then Lisbon would be rebuilt, not as it had been, but better, more rational, more resistant to future disasters. The earthquake had cleared the slate. Now they would write something new upon it. Whether the survivors of the catastrophe shared his vision, or simply his determination to continue, Lisbon would indeed rise again from its ashes. But first, there were still bodies to bury, wounds to treat, and the long, difficult work of learning to live in a world that the earth had proven could be destroyed in minutes. Part 4: The Reckoning. Winter came early to Lisbon in 1755, or perhaps it only seemed that way to people who now lived in tents and lean-tos, exposed to elements that had once been kept at bay by walls and roofs. Rain fell on November 15th, a cold Atlantic rain that turned the ash-covered ruins into a grey paste and flooded the improvised shelters where tens of thousands huddled. The rain was, in one sense, a mercy. It finally extinguished the last smoldering fires that had persisted in deep cellars and beneath heavy rubble. But it also brought misery to the survivors and created new dangers as weakened walls, saturated with water, collapsed without warning. Maria Rodriguez had found shelter in a tent city that sprawled across the hills of Graca, east of the destroyed city center. She shared a canvas shelter with 11 other people, none of whom she had known before the earthquake. They were an accidental family formed by catastrophe, 2 elderly sisters who had lost their home in Alfama, a family of 4 from the Moreira district, a young man who had been a clerk in the Casa de India and who now had neither employment nor employer, and 3 children who had been found wandering in the ruins, unable to speak, perhaps unable to remember their names. No one knew who their parents had been. Perhaps they were buried in the mass graves. Perhaps they had been carried out to sea by the tsunami. The children simply sat in the corner of the tent, holding each other, staring at nothing. The organization of these camps was simultaneously impressive and inadequate. Pombal's administration had managed to establish basic systems remarkably quickly: food distribution centers, latrines dug at safe distances from water sources, patrols to maintain order. But the scale of need overwhelmed even the most efficient systems. There was never enough food, never enough clean water, never enough medicine or blankets or basic supplies. People waited in lines for hours to receive a day's ration of bread and dried fish. Fights broke out over distribution. Accusations of favoritism and corruption flew, though Pombal's soldiers generally kept violence from escalating. Disease was the new enemy, as inevitable as it was deadly. Typhus appeared first, spreading through the crowded camps where lice moved easily from person to person. Then came dysentery, caused by contaminated water and the impossibility of maintaining sanitation in such conditions. Smallpox followed, finding ready victims among people whose resistance had been lowered by stress, inadequate nutrition, and exposure to cold. Every morning, the burial details moved through the camps, collecting the bodies of those who had died during the night. The dead were wrapped in whatever cloth was available and taken to the growing mass graves on the city's outskirts. There were no longer individual funerals. Death had become too common for individual acknowledgement. Father Antonio Pereira moved between the camps, offering what comfort he could. His faith, tested so severely in the immediate aftermath of the earthquake, had evolved into something more complex. He could no longer offer the simple certainties he had once preached, that God was good, that suffering had meaning, that the righteous were rewarded and the wicked punished. The earthquake had made a mockery of such simplicities. He had seen the wicked survive and prosper while the righteous perished in collapsed churches. He had seen children crushed and villains escape without a scratch. But he had also seen extraordinary kindness. He had seen the wealthy share their resources with strangers, seen the poor divide their meager rations with those who had even less, seen people risk their lives to save others they did not know. If the earthquake had revealed human vulnerability and the universe's indifference to human concerns, it had also revealed something else, a capacity for compassion and solidarity that seemed to exist independent of divine command or expectation of reward. People helped each other not because God told them to, but because not helping was unthinkable. Perhaps, Father Pereira thought, this was its own kind of grace. In the royal camp at Belém, King Jose I remained deeply traumatized. He had developed what would now be recognized as severe anxiety and claustrophobia. He refused to sleep inside any building, even the intact structures at Belém, and instead insisted on remaining in the tent that had been erected for him immediately after the earthquake. This tent would be his residence for more than a year. Even years later, when reconstruction was well underway, the king could not be persuaded to live in the new royal palace. He would spend the rest of his life in elaborate wooden pavilions, structures that could be quickly exited if the earth began to shake again. The king's psychological collapse meant that governance fell even more completely to Pombal, who seized the opportunity with both hands. In the chaos of the disaster's aftermath, he accumulated powers that would have been unthinkable in normal times. He controlled the distribution of food and supplies, commanded the army, directed the reconstruction, administered justice, and gradually sidelined or eliminated anyone who might challenge his authority. The old nobility, already weakened by the destruction of their urban palaces and the loss of their rental income from destroyed properties, found themselves outmaneuvered by a minister who seemed to work 20 hours a day and who had no patience for traditional privileges or procedures. The question of reconstruction was central to everything. Should Lisbon be rebuilt as it had been, or should the catastrophe be treated as an opportunity to create something new? Pombal came down firmly on the side of radical reconstruction. The old city, he argued, had been a medieval maze, inefficient, unhealthy, impossible to defend, and as the earthquake had proven, highly vulnerable to disaster. The new Lisbon would be different. He assembled a team of military engineers and architects and gave them an extraordinary brief: redesign the city center according to rational principles. The result was the Pombaline Plan, one of the first examples of large-scale urban planning in European history. The new Baixa district would be built on a grid pattern, with wide streets that could serve as fire breaks and that would be easier to navigate than the medieval tangle they replaced. Buildings would be constructed using a new technique, the Pombaline cage, a wooden frame designed to flex during earthquakes rather than collapse, with the spaces between the wooden beams filled with rubble and the exterior covered with plaster. This was perhaps the world's first earthquake-resistant building technique, developed through systematic testing in which military engineers would march troops around model buildings to simulate earthquake forces. The new buildings would be uniform in height and architectural style, creating visual harmony and, not incidentally, making the construction process more efficient. The waterfront would be reorganized around a massive new plaza, eventually named the Praça do Comércio, that would proclaim Portugal's continued imperial ambitions despite the disaster. Everything would be planned, measured, controlled. Pombal's new Lisbon would be a triumph of rationality over chaos, of human will over natural disaster. But implementing this vision required something difficult, clearing away what remained of the old city. Many buildings had been badly damaged but not completely destroyed. Their owners hoped to repair them, to salvage something from the catastrophe. Pombal's plan required demolishing these damaged structures to make way for the new grid. This created fierce resistance from property owners who saw their wealth being literally demolished by government order. Pombal responded with characteristic ruthlessness, sending in demolition teams backed by soldiers to tear down buildings whose owners refused to comply voluntarily. Compensation was promised but often delayed or inadequate. Many of Lisbon's old families, already impoverished by the disaster, were pushed into complete ruin by the reconstruction policies. The financing of reconstruction raised equally difficult questions. Portugal's economy had been devastated. The gold from Brazil that had flowed so abundantly into Lisbon was now needed more desperately than ever, but the infrastructure for collecting and processing that wealth had been destroyed. The customs house was rubble. The records of debts and credits had burned. Ships had been lost. Warehouses and their contents had been consumed by fire. The immediate cost of relief, feeding and housing the survivors, clearing rubble, burying the dead, was enormous. The cost of rebuilding would be exponentially greater. Pombal implemented a series of measures to raise funds. Taxes were increased, particularly on the nobility and the church, both of which had been accustomed to considerable exemptions. Crown lands were sold. Loans were secured from foreign banks, though at rates that reflected Portugal's weakened position. And perhaps most controversially, Pombal used the disaster as justification for seizing assets from the Jesuits, whom he had long viewed as rivals to royal authority. The Jesuits, he claimed, had been stockpiling wealth while the nation suffered. Their properties were confiscated, their members expelled from Portugal in 1759. This move served multiple purposes. It provided some funding for reconstruction, it eliminated a powerful political rival, and it aligned with Enlightenment sentiments against religious orders that Pombal increasingly embraced. Throughout 1756 and 1757, the work of clearing and rebuilding proceeded. It was brutal, dangerous labor. Workers dug through rubble that could shift without warning, burying them as thoroughly as the earthquake had buried its victims. They handled stones contaminated with the remains of the dead, worked in clouds of dust that filled their lungs, hauled enormous weights with nothing but muscle power and simple machines. Accidents were common, and the injured often received only the most basic medical care. But the work provided wages at a time when most forms of employment had disappeared, so people accepted the dangers and the hardship. Joaquim Santos, missing one leg and most of his family, found work in the reconstruction despite his disability. He operated a crane, a simple device of ropes and pulleys, that lifted stones from the rubble. He was paid a pittance, barely enough to afford food and a space in a boarding house, but the work gave him something more valuable than money. It gave him a reason to wake up each morning. As long as he was working, lifting stones, contributing in some small way to the rebuilding of the city, he did not have to think too much about the darkness beneath the Igreja do Carmo, about the sounds his children had made as they died, about the weight of his wife's hand growing cold in his. The psychological toll of the disaster extended far beyond those like Santos who had lost loved ones. The entire society was traumatized, living in constant fear of another earthquake. Every tremor, and Portugal experienced numerous minor earthquakes in the months following the disaster, sent people running into the streets in panic. Some survivors developed what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, unable to sleep, plagued by nightmares, hypervigilant to any sign of danger. Children who had been orphaned by the disaster grew up in institutions with no memory of their origins, carrying wounds they could not articulate, and that their society had no framework for understanding or treating. Yet life, as it always does, began to reassert itself. In the tent cities and makeshift shelters, babies were born. Couples married, perhaps seeking comfort in human connection, perhaps simply following the biological imperative to continue despite everything. Markets reopened, first as informal gatherings where survivors traded what they had salvaged, later as more organized affairs. Taverns and shops began operating again, often in damaged buildings that had been shored up enough to be marginally safe. Street vendors hawked food and cheap goods. Musicians played in squares, passing a hat for coins. Lisbon was not dead, not entirely, and the signs of returning life were simultaneously hopeful and heartbreaking. Hopeful because they showed resilience, heartbreaking because they seemed such inadequate responses to such overwhelming loss. The earthquake's effects extended far beyond Lisbon. The tsunami had struck coastal towns throughout Portugal, Spain, and Morocco with devastating effect. In Morocco, the city of Agadir was destroyed, with casualties estimated at 10,000. In Spain, Cadiz was badly damaged by both earthquake and tsunami, with waves reported to have reached heights of 60 feet. The tsunami crossed the Atlantic, causing damage in the Caribbean and even reaching the coast of Brazil. Ships as far away as Norway and Finland reported unusual wave activity. The earthquake had been felt across a vast area of Europe and North Africa, making it one of the most widely experienced seismic events in recorded history. This geographic scale meant that news of the disaster spread quickly. Within days, reports were being published in newspapers across Europe. Within weeks, engravings depicting the destruction were being sold in London, Paris, Amsterdam, and Vienna. The Lisbon earthquake became an international event, discussed in coffee houses and salons, debated by philosophers and theologians, turned into cautionary tales by preachers and moralizers. The international response included genuine charity. Money was donated from across Catholic Europe to help the survivors. The popes sent financial aid, as did the kings of France and Spain. Protestant nations, despite their religious differences with Catholic Portugal, also contributed. Hamburg sent ships loaded with provisions. London merchants organized relief funds. This international solidarity, while welcome, could not begin to address the scale of the disaster, but it represented something important, a recognition that some catastrophes transcended national and religious boundaries, that human suffering demanded response regardless of politics or theology. By the end of 1757, 2 years after the earthquake, a visitor to Lisbon would have found a city in transition. Much of the central district remained rubble, though the rubble was now organized into sorted piles, stone here, wood there, metal in another location, all to be reused in the reconstruction. But construction of the new city had begun. The first buildings of the Pombaline Baixa were rising, their wooden cage frames visible before they were covered with plaster. The new grid of streets was taking shape, wide and straight, an assertion of order imposed on the chaos that nature had created. But the psychological rebuilding would take far longer than the physical reconstruction. An entire generation would grow up in the shadow of the disaster, shaped by stories of that terrible morning when the earth had opened and swallowed a city. They would carry that knowledge with them, the knowledge that the ground beneath their feet, which seemed so solid, so permanent, could betray them without warning. They would build their new city, would prosper and suffer in the ordinary ways that humans always do, but they would never entirely forget. The earth had spoken on November 1st, 1755, and its message was one that no one who heard it could entirely dismiss, that human ambitions, human constructions, human lives themselves existed on sufferance, subject to forces that did not care about prayer or wealth or power, forces that could erase in minutes what had taken centuries to build. Lisbon would rise again, but it would never be the same. And perhaps that was the final lesson of the earthquake, that some losses cannot be recovered, some wounds do not heal, and survival sometimes means learning to live with irreparable damage. Part 5. Tremors Through Time. By 1760, 5 years after the catastrophe, Lisbon had begun to resemble a city again, though it remained a construction site on a colossal scale. The Pombaline Baixa arose steadily from the ruins, its geometric precision a stark contrast to the organic chaos of the medieval city it replaced. The new buildings, with their innovative earthquake-resistant wooden frames, stood as monuments to human ingenuity and defiance, or perhaps, as some whispered, as monuments to human hubris, as if any structure built by human hands could truly withstand the earth's fury when it chose to unleash itself again. The reconstruction had created its own economy, its own social order. Thousands of workers, carpenters, masons, laborers, craftsmen, had flooded into Lisbon from the provinces and from abroad, drawn by wages that were high by the standards of the time, even if they barely covered the inflated cost of living in a city where everything was scarce. The streets rang with the sounds of construction, hammers striking stone, saws cutting timber, the shouts of foremen directing crews, the creaking of cranes and pulleys lifting materials into place. Dust hung perpetually in the air, a fine gray powder that covered everything, that lodged in lungs and turned handkerchiefs black when people coughed into them. Maria Rodriguez was still alive, though she had aged a decade in 5 years. She had found work as a cook in one of the boarding houses that had sprung up to house reconstruction workers, a job that provided her with room, board, and a small wage. Her hands, which had once been damaged by wash water, were now scarred by burns from kitchen fires and rough from handling heavy pots. But she was surviving, which was more than could be said for many. She had learned not to think too much about what had been lost. Her neighbors from Alfama, the church where she had prayed, the narrow streets she had known like the lines of her own palm. The past was a dangerous country. To dwell there too long was to risk madness. The tent cities had mostly disappeared, replaced by more permanent structures, though permanent was a relative term. Many survivors lived in wooden barracks hastily constructed by the government, buildings that were supposed to be temporary but that were already showing signs of becoming permanent slums. These barracks were crowded, poorly ventilated, prone to fire, and breeding grounds for disease. But they were shelter, and they were free or nearly free, and for people who had lost everything, they represented a kind of stability, however precarious. Joaquim Santos had not survived to see 1760. He had died in the winter of 1758, of pneumonia complicated by the general deterioration of his health. The amputation of his leg had never properly healed, becoming infected repeatedly, draining his strength. But it was not really the infection that killed him, the doctor at the charity hospital had confided to a colleague. It was grief. The man had simply lost the will to live, had stopped fighting, had let go. He was buried in one of the mass graves on the city's outskirts, his name recorded in a ledger that would eventually be lost in a fire decades later, erasing even that minimal trace of his existence. His daughter Anna, however, survived. At 13 years old, she had been placed in the Convento de Santos Novo, one of the convents that had survived the earthquake relatively intact. She would grow up among the nuns, would learn to read and write, rare skills for a girl of her class, and would eventually take vows herself, becoming Sister Anna Teresa. She would live to be 73. And would occasionally tell the younger nuns about the morning when the earth had moved, when she had been pulled alive from the ruins of a church while her mother and siblings lay dead around her. But she told these stories less and less as the years passed, and eventually stopped telling them at all. Some memories were too heavy to share, too painful to examine. They became like stones carried inside her, shaping her from within but never spoken of. Father Antonio Pereira had undergone his own transformation. The earthquake had broken something in his previous faith, but it had not destroyed his calling. He had come to believe in a different kind of God, not the micromanaging deity who intervened in human affairs, who punished the wicked and rewarded the righteous, but something more distant and more mysterious, a creative force that had set the universe in motion and that allowed it to operate according to natural laws, laws that included earthquakes and tsunamis, suffering and death, but also beauty and compassion and the stubborn human insistence on continuing despite everything. He had written extensively about his experiences and his evolving theology, and his writings had attracted attention beyond Portugal. Correspondence came from philosophers and theologians across Europe, engaging with his ideas, challenging them, building upon them. Without quite intending to, Father Pereira had become part of a larger conversation about the nature of God, the problem of evil, and the relationship between faith and reason, a conversation that the Lisbon earthquake had catalyzed but that extended far beyond the immediate disaster. One of his correspondents was a French writer named François-Marie Hérouet, better known by his pen name Voltaire, who had published his Poème sur le désastre de Lisbonne in 1756. Voltaire's poem had been a searing critique of philosophical optimism, mocking the idea that we lived in the best of all possible worlds. How could this be the best possible world, Voltaire demanded, when innocent people were crushed in churches while praying, when children were buried alive, when an entire city could be destroyed in minutes? The poem had caused a sensation, had been banned in several countries, and had secured Voltaire's reputation as the most dangerous intellectual in Europe. Father Pereira had read the poem with mixed feelings. He agreed with Voltaire's critique of facile optimism, but he found the Frenchman's tone troubling, too glib, too certain of his own righteousness, too quick to dismiss the genuine faith of people who had suffered but who had not lost their belief in meaning and purpose. In his response, which was published in a Lisbon journal in 1759, Father Pereira had written, Monsieur Voltaire mocks those who claim we live in the best of all possible worlds, and in this mockery he is correct. But he offers nothing in place of the belief he destroys. To say that the world is not the best possible is not the same as saying it is without purpose or meaning. Perhaps the lesson is simpler, that we do not live in a world made for our comfort, but in a world that demands our engagement, our labor, our compassion for one another. If God exists, perhaps His greatest gift is not that He prevents suffering, but that He has given us the capacity to respond to it with love. The letter had attracted little attention at the time. Father Pereira was not famous, and Lisbon journals had limited circulation, but it represented a strand of thinking that was emerging from the ruins, a more modest, more human-centered faith that did not require belief in divine intervention but that also did not surrender to nihilism or despair. Pombal, meanwhile, had consolidated his power almost completely. The disaster that had destroyed the city had made him, in effect, the second most powerful man in Portugal, limited only nominally by a king who remained psychologically incapable of effective rule. Pombal had used this power to reshape not just Lisbon but the entire Portuguese state. He had curtailed the power of the Inquisition, expelled the Jesuits, reduced the privileges of the old nobility, reformed the university system, promoted trade and manufacturing, and generally dragged Portugal, sometimes literally kicking and screaming, toward what he considered modernity. His methods were autocratic, often brutal. Political opponents disappeared into prisons. Dissent was crushed. The nobility that had once dominated Portuguese politics found itself systematically marginalized. When a conspiracy involving members of the Tavora family, one of Portugal's most distinguished noble houses, was uncovered in 1758, Pombal's response was savage. The conspirators were tortured and executed with a cruelty that shocked even by 18th-century standards. The Tavora family was legally abolished, their properties confiscated, their very name forbidden. Whether the conspiracy had been real or manufactured by Pombal remains debated by historians, but its effect was undeniable. After 1758, no one in Portugal dared openly challenge the minister's authority. The reconstruction of Lisbon was Pombal's most visible achievement, and his most enduring legacy. By 1765, the Pombaline Baixa was substantially complete. The new district was unlike anything else in Europe, a planned urban space created not over centuries of organic growth but in a single burst of directed activity. The grid of streets was wide and straight, designed for commerce and traffic. The buildings were uniform in height and style, their regularity creating a visual harmony that struck visitors as either beautiful or monotonous, depending on their taste. The Praça do Comércio, the vast plaza that opened onto the Tagus, proclaimed Portugal's continued imperial ambitions with its triumphal arch and equestrian statue of King José I. But beneath this surface of order and rationality, Lisbon remained a wounded city. The survivors of 1755 carried their trauma with them, and they passed it on to their children and grandchildren. Every minor tremor and minor earthquakes were common in Portugal, provoked panic disproportionate to the actual danger. People who had never experienced the great earthquake themselves nevertheless grew up with an awareness of catastrophe, a knowledge that the ground beneath their feet was not entirely trustworthy. The economic recovery was slower and less complete than the physical reconstruction. Portugal had been declining as a great power even before the earthquake, its economy too dependent on Brazilian gold, its industrial base underdeveloped, its agriculture inefficient. The earthquake had accelerated this decline, destroying accumulated wealth and diverting resources to reconstruction that might otherwise have been invested in economic development. By the 1770s, it was becoming clear that Portugal would never again be a first-rank European power. Spain, France, and especially Britain were pulling ahead, building global empires based on manufacturing and trade rather than on extraction of colonial resources. Portugal's moment had passed, and the earthquake, while not solely responsible for this decline, had certainly hastened it. Yet there were unexpected benefits from the disaster, particularly in the realm of knowledge. The Lisbon earthquake became one of the most thoroughly documented natural disasters in history to that point, and this documentation served scientific purposes. Pombal had sent questionnaires to every parish in Portugal, asking detailed questions about what had been observed. When did the earthquake strike? How long did it last? How many shocks were felt? What was the direction of building collapses? What happened to water levels in wells and rivers? The responses, compiled into a massive archive, provided data that would be used by scientists for centuries to study earthquake mechanisms. This systematic collection of observational data was revolutionary. Previous earthquakes had been documented through chronicles and personal accounts, but there had never been a coordinated effort to gather standardized information across a wide geographic area. Pombal's questionnaire, likely designed more for administrative purposes than scientific ones, inadvertently created one of the first modern scientific datasets about earthquakes. Later researchers would use this information to estimate the earthquake's magnitude, locate its epicenter, and understand how seismic waves propagated through different types of soil and rock. The earthquake also spurred technological innovation. The Pombaline cage system of earthquake-resistant construction was tested and refined through practical experience. Military engineers developed models to simulate earthquake forces, creating what were essentially the first shake tables. Architects began thinking about how building design could mitigate earthquake damage. This knowledge would spread slowly beyond Portugal, but it represented an important shift, the idea that humans could, through intelligent design, reduce their vulnerability to natural disasters. By 1770, Lisbon had a population of approximately 180,000, substantial, but still below the pre-earthquake level, and far below what it would have been without the disaster. The city had been rebuilt, but many who had fled had never returned, finding new lives in the provinces or abroad. The Portuguese diaspora had been accelerated by the disaster, with emigrants carrying their memories of the earthquake to Brazil, to Africa, to the far corners of Portugal's empire, where they told their stories and shaped how these distant communities understood catastrophe and survival. King Jose I died in 1777, still living in wooden pavilions, still refusing to enter a stone building, still haunted by the morning when his palace had collapsed around him. His daughter Maria succeeded him, and one of her first acts was to dismiss Pombal. The old minister, now 78 years old, was stripped of his titles and sent into internal exile. He died in 1782, bitter and unrepentant, convinced that he had saved Portugal and been rewarded with ingratitude. History's judgment would be more nuanced. Pombal had been a tyrant, but an effective one. He had caused suffering, but he had also prevented greater suffering. He had built a new Lisbon, but at a cost that extended beyond mere money. Maria Rodriguez died in 1775, 20 years after the earthquake. She was buried in the cemetery of São Jorge, in a marked grave, a privilege that many disaster victims had been denied. Her grave marker, a simple stone with her name and dates, would survive into the 21st century, weathered but legible, one of countless small monuments to individual lives that had intersected with catastrophe and continued, against odds, until their natural end. The Lisbon earthquake never entirely faded from memory, though its sharp edges dulled with time. It became part of the city's identity, a story told to children, a reference point for understanding how the city had come to look as it did. When tourists visited the ruined Igreja do Carmo, its roof still open to the sky, Pombal had ordered it left as a memorial. They were told about the morning when the earth had moved, when thousands had died in collapsed churches, when a great city had been brought low. But perhaps the earthquake's deepest impact was philosophical rather than physical. It forced European intellectuals to confront uncomfortable truths about the universe and humanity's place within it. The comfortable certainties of the early Enlightenment, the belief in a rational, orderly universe governed by a benevolent deity, had been shaken as thoroughly as Lisbon's buildings. In their place came harder questions, questions without easy answers. What did it mean to live in a universe that could destroy without warning or purpose? How could one maintain faith, or hope, or meaning, in the face of such overwhelming evidence of nature's indifference? What was the proper human response to catastrophe? Different thinkers answered differently. Voltaire turned toward skepticism and social reform, arguing that if we couldn't count on divine justice, we had better create human justice. Rousseau argued for a return to simpler, more natural modes of living, away from the dangerous concentrations of cities. Kant worked toward a purely scientific understanding of earthquakes, trying to remove supernatural explanations from natural phenomena. The Lisbon earthquake became, in effect, a Rorschach test onto which philosophers projected their various visions of what the world was and what humanity should do within it. For the survivors themselves, the answers were often simpler and more personal. They rebuilt because not rebuilding was unthinkable. They had children because life insists on continuing. They went to church or didn't, believed or doubted, found meaning or resigned themselves to its absence. They lived their ordinary lives in a city that had been destroyed and rebuilt, carrying their memories like scars, visible or hidden, but always present. By the time the 19th century arrived, Lisbon had been transformed. The Pombaline Baixa stood as proof that cities could be rationally planned, that disaster could be an opportunity for improvement, that human will could impose order on chaos. But it also stood as proof of something else, that every human creation exists on borrowed time, that the ground beneath our feet is less solid than it appears, that the universe does not guarantee our survival or success. The earthquake had spoken, and its message echoed through the centuries: build if you must. Plan if you will. Create your cities and your civilizations and your dreams of permanence. But know that the earth is old and powerful and utterly indifferent to your ambitions. It can take back in minutes what took centuries to create. Your survival depends not on divine favor or natural right, but on chance, on preparation, on the kindness of strangers, and on your own stubborn refusal to surrender to despair. Lisbon learned this lesson in blood and fire and falling stone. The city that rose from the ruins was different from what had been destroyed, more rational perhaps, more planned, more resistant to future shocks. But it was also more humble, more aware of its own fragility, more conscious that human civilization is always and everywhere a precarious achievement, sustained not by its inevitability, but by the daily choice to continue, to rebuild, to go on despite everything the universe might do to us. The tremors of November 1st, 1755, had finally stilled. But their echoes would continue, rippling forward through time, shaping how we understand disaster, survival, and the strange resilience of the human spirit when confronted with forces beyond its control or comprehension.